BRM second chapter, third video. So in this video, let us understand about the sampling plan and sample size, which could be given for 5 marks. Let's understand about the steps to be followed by a researcher in developing the sampling plan. So there are around 7 steps which need to be followed by a researcher while he decide about the sampling plan. First and foremost, he need to define the target population. So target population, as we have discussed in the earlier videos, so the population from whom he can draw the sample is nothing but target population. In our example, the students who is studying in India, who is listening to the online classes will fall under this category. Suppose if you reduce the area of India to Karnataka and further from Karnataka to Bangalore, so the students who is listening to the online classes in Bangalore will fall under the category of target population. So why it is necessary for a researcher to first define the target population is because once he know the count of target population, it is easy for him to determine the sample size. So first step is to define the target population. The next step is to select the data collection method. As we know, there are broadly two different types of data, that is primary and secondary data. In the primary data, there are different kinds of methods that can be used by the researcher to collect the data, like interview method, observation method, schedule method, survey method, or mail survey method, or it's a telephone method. So any one of that method, according to his research areas or research requirements, the researcher has to determine which data collection method he need to use in order to collect his data from the samples. The third step is that to determine the necessary sample size. While he determined the necessary sample size or the sample size for his research, there are various factors he need to consider. After he considered the various factors like his nature or even the accuracy which is required for his study, or homogeneity or heterogeneity which is required for his study. So it depends on various factors. Apart from that, he can use the formula in order to determine its sample size. For this, first he has to know the population. Based on the target population, he can determine the sample size. The fourth step is to identify the sampling frames needed. Sampling frame we have discussed in the last video. So all the samples who are eligible to be all the population who are eligible to be selected as samples are nothing but the sample frame. So he has to define or identify who are those his sample frames. In our example, the students who are studying in Bangalore or listening to the online classes will come under this sampling frame. The next step is to select the appropriate sampling method. As we know, there are two different kinds of sampling method, broadly speaking, that is probability and non-probability. Under this, we have various types of sampling techniques. For example, simple random technique or systematic random technique or cluster technique, or even in non-probability we have like judgment sampling, snowball sampling, convenience sampling. So as a researcher, he has to first determine which is the appropriate sampling technique to be chosen by him in order to select the samples. So the next one is he has to create an operating plan for selecting the sample units. Operating plan in the sense that he has to determine how he can approach to the people to collect the data from the sampling units. So after all the above 6 steps, finally he has to execute his operational plan. Let me summarize. First, he has to define his target population. The next thing, he has to decide whether it's an interview method or a observation method, which data collection method he has to use in order to determine the sample plan. The next one is he has to determine how much sample size is required in order to collect the data from that sample. The next one is he has to identify the sampling frame from whom he can collect the data. The next, he has to decide on which sampling method he has to use in order to select the information from the sample. Then he has to create an entire detailed operating plan of how he can approach the people and collect the data from them. People here is nothing but the sample units. The next one is finally he has to execute the operational plan. So let's move on with the next topic, that is factors influencing on sample size. This topic is also important for 5 marks. So while a researcher is fixing the sample size, so let's understand what are the factors he has to take into consideration while determining the sample size. The first and foremost is the size of the universe. We already know what is the meaning of universe. Universe is nothing but the total population or the uh, target population. Mainly it's a target population. If the target population is very high, for example, if the target population, let us take you are studying about the students or a bank customers kind of, the target population itself is very high. So when the target population is very high, obviously the sample size which you determine should also be very high. Vice versa, where if your target population is less, then the size or the sample size which you determine should be less. The same way, availability of resources. Availability of resources is nothing but the sample or a population who are readily accessible to give information to you. If their availability is more, then the sample size should be more. If the availability of the people itself is very less, uh, then the sample size should be less. The next thing is degree of accuracy. Suppose if you're collecting the data in order to know about the disease pattern from certain patients, then the accuracy level should be very high. Then obviously the sample size which you determine should also be very high. If the degree of accuracy is very less, then the sample size could be less. Then homogeneity or heterogeneity of the universe. Homogeneity is nothing but the similar kind. Heterogeneity is different kinds. For example, you are collecting the data from the students. So the students here has different categories, right? In the sense, it has a heterogeneity. So they belong to different courses. Okay, so if the heterogeneity is more, then you have to collect the data from each course of the students. So if you're collecting the data from bank customers, so everybody who has an account will be called as a bank customers. So that's why the homogeneity is more. Then if the homogeneity is more, then the sample size could be less. If heterogeneity is more, then the sample size should be more. Next, the method of sampling adopted. So it also depends on which technique you are adopting in order to select your data. Suppose if you are adopting the convenience sampling, then obviously your sampling method could be a little higher because you're convenient to get it. But if you're adopting some snowball sampling method, so your sampling data could be less because the chances of getting the data could be little less. The next one is the nature of respondents. So if the nature of your respondents, like if the people, you already know that the people are reluctant to give the answers to the questions which you ask. If the questionnaire is distributed and the people are not very interested to give a answer to you, then the sample size that you need to determine should be very high. If you already know that you can definitely get the response from your respondents, then your sample size could be less. So this is all about the factors influencing the sample size. So let's understand about the different types of sampling techniques in the next video.